By the spring of 1945, Germany's defeat was no longer a question of if but only when. But to understand why May 8th became the day of surrender, we need to go back to the decisions that gradually led to the collapse of the Third Reich. After the failure of the Blitzkrieg against the Soviet Union and the entry of the United States into the war, Germany found itself in a strategic position that required more resources than it could provide. The war on two fronts, which Hitler had sought to avoid, became a reality. Industry was working at full capacity, but the Allies had the advantage in human and material resources. In 1943 to 1944, the situation became critical. Defeats on the Eastern Front, the Allied landings in Normandy, and the bombing of German cities all destroyed the Reich's military machine. The army was still fighting hard, but the initiative had been lost. In early 1945, the Red Army advanced rapidly from the east, and the Western Allies crossed the Rhine. The German defense was collapsing, although some units continued to resist. Berlin became a symbol of the last line of defense. The political situation within the Reich also deteriorated. Hitler isolated himself in a bunker, believing in non-existent reserves. Commanders received contradictory orders, and the civilian population suffered from constant shelling and bombing. The Allies, for their part, acted in a coordinated manner. They sought unconditional surrender, without conditions that would allow Germany to rebuild its military strength. This position had been formulated earlier and remained unchanged. In April 1945, Soviet troops surrounded Berlin. The city was in ruins. The fighting was fierce, but the outcome was clear. On April 30th, Hitler committed suicide. This was a psychological turning point for the Nazi leadership. After Hitler's death, the new leadership, headed by Admiral Dönitz, tried to negotiate with the Western Allies, hoping to avoid complete Soviet occupation. But the Allies insisted that the surrender must be complete and cover all fronts. Germany was left with no real options. The army was retreating, cities were destroyed, and supplies had stopped. The war was effectively lost. All that remained was to formally end it. Thus, the country that had started the war in 1939 with confidence in a quick victory found itself facing the inevitable 6 years later: unconditional surrender. In April 1945, Berlin became the center of the final act of the war in Europe. Soviet troops surrounded the city, gradually tightening the ring around the capital of the Reich. Battles were fought for every street, every house, every bridge. The city, once a symbol of the power of the Nazi state, was transformed into a labyrinth of ruins. The German units defending the capital consisted of remnants of the regular army, SS units, and the Volkssturm, often elderly men and teenagers. Their motivation varied from fanatical belief to simple fear of punishment. But even the most devoted could not change the strategic reality. Soviet troops advanced with heavy losses. Street fighting was fierce and uncompromising. Artillery and tanks were used at close range. Fire turned neighborhoods into ruins. Berlin was slowly collapsing along with the regime that had created it. In an underground bunker beneath the Reich Chancellery, Hitler continued to issue orders that no longer mattered. His strategic view of the world remained detached from reality. He believed in imaginary counterattacks and non-existent reserves, but even those closest to him understood that the end was near. On April 30th, 1945, Hitler committed suicide. His death was the symbolic end of Nazi leadership, but the fighting continued. Some units were still trying to break through to the west, hoping to surrender to the Americans or British rather than the Soviet troops. On May 2nd, Berlin officially surrendered to the Red Army. The city was taken, but the war in Europe was not yet formally over. In other areas of the front, German units continued to resist or retreat. Meanwhile, the new German leadership, headed by Admiral Karl Dönitz, tried to find a way out. Its main goal was to buy time, to allow as many German soldiers as possible to surrender to the Western Allies instead of the Soviet troops. It was an attempt to mitigate the consequences of inevitable defeat. But the Allies had already agreed. The surrender had to be complete, simultaneous, and unconditional. No separate peace, no regional agreements. Germany had to lay down its arms on all fronts. After the fall of Berlin, it became clear that the war was practically over. All that remained was to formalize it legally. Representatives of the German command began negotiations on the terms of surrender. Berlin was the last battlefield, but not the last step. Ahead was the moment that would formally end 6 years of the most massive war in European history. After the fall of Berlin and Hitler's death, Germany's new leadership found itself in a situation where time was running out. The army was losing control, the fronts were collapsing, and millions of refugees were moving west. Admiral Karl Dönitz, who had declared himself Hitler's successor, understood that continuing the war made no sense. But he wanted to control the process of ending the war. His main goal was to drag out the negotiations so that as many German troops as possible could surrender to the Western Allies, avoiding Soviet captivity. It was for this purpose that a delegation headed by General Alfred Jodl was sent to the Allied headquarters in the French city of Reims. Reims was the headquarters of General Dwight Eisenhower, Commander-in-Chief of the Allied forces in Western Europe. It was here that not only the military but also the political fate of Germany was decided. The Allies already had a common position. The surrender must be complete, unconditional, and extend to all fronts. The negotiations were short and tough. The German side tried to limit the surrender to the Western Front only, but this proposal was immediately rejected. The Allies insisted that the war would end at the same time for everyone. On the night of May 6th to 7th, 1945, the Act of Unconditional Surrender of Germany was signed. The document provided for the cessation of all hostilities on May 8th at 23:01 Central European Time. Jodl signed it, effectively acknowledging the defeat of the Reich. But that was not the end of the story. The Soviet Union insisted on a repeat signing ceremony in Berlin, arguing that it had suffered the greatest losses and had the right to the final procedure in the capital of the defeated enemy. Thus, the surrender had to be confirmed once again. Despite the diplomatic nuances, news of the signing in Reims spread quickly. In London, Paris, and New York, people began to take to the streets. They were still waiting for the official announcement, but they understood that the war in Europe was effectively over. For German soldiers, the order meant a ceasefire. For millions of civilians, it meant the end of fear of bombing and frontline fighting. But for many in Eastern Europe, it meant the beginning of a new phase: Soviet occupation. Reims became the place where the war legally ended for the first time. But the final symbolic finale was still ahead, in ruined Berlin. Although the surrender document had already been signed in Reims, this was not enough for the Soviet Union. Moscow insisted on a repeat ceremony in Berlin itself, the capital of the defeated regime. For Stalin, it was not just a matter of formality, but also of symbolism. It was the Red Army that had taken the city, and it was the Red Army that had suffered enormous losses on the Eastern Front. On May 8, 1945, a second signing ceremony took place in the ruins of Berlin. Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel represented the German side. He signed the Act of Unconditional Surrender before representatives of the Soviet Union, the United States, Great Britain, and France. The ceremony was short but tense. Keitel tried to clarify certain details, but the Allies were adamant. The war ended on their terms. Germany acknowledged its complete defeat. Due to the time difference, Victory Day in Europe was celebrated on May 8th, while in the Soviet Union it was celebrated on May 9th. But the essence remained the same. 6 years of war in Europe had officially ended. The news of the surrender sparked an explosion of emotion. In London, people gathered at Buckingham Palace. In Paris, bells rang out. In New York, Times Square was transformed into a sea of flags. Soldiers hugged each other. Strangers greeted each other. Joy was mixed with exhaustion. However, this day was not perceived the same way everywhere. For the countries of Central and Eastern Europe, victory over Nazism meant the arrival of a new reality. the Soviet sphere of influence. The war was over, but the political struggle was just beginning. For Germany, May 8th was a day of collapse. The state ceased to exist as a sovereign power. The country was divided into occupation zones, and its future was decided by the victors. The era of post-war reconstruction began. Berlin, lying in ruins, became a symbol of the end of the old order. The city that had been the heart of Nazi power now became the center of new geopolitical tensions. May 8, 1945, became a date that went down in history as Victory Day in Europe. It did not erase the tragedy of the war, but it put an end to one of the darkest chapters in European history. May 8, 1945, was the day millions had been waiting for. After years of frontline reports, funeral announcements, and air raid sirens, Europe finally heard the news. The war was over. From London to New York, from Paris to Moscow, people took to the streets. The joy was spontaneous, loud, and sometimes chaotic. In Great Britain, Prime Minister Winston Churchill addressed the nation, announcing victory. People flooded the streets, singing, hugging, and celebrating near Buckingham Palace. After years of bombing and harsh restrictions, it was a moment of relief. In France, the celebration had a special meaning. Paris, liberated in 1944, was now officially ending the war. For the French, it was a victory over occupation, over fear, over years of humiliation. In the U.S., the news sparked an explosion of emotion. Times Square in New York became the center of the celebrations. But even at that moment, many Americans remembered that the war against Japan was still going on. The victory in Europe was great, but not final. In the Soviet Union, the celebrations had a different tone. Victory came at the cost of millions of lives. Cities were destroyed. Families lost loved ones. May 9th became a day of triumph, but also a day of deep remembrance. For soldiers on the front lines, this day was a moment of silence. Many heard the news not in the city, but in camps, in occupied territories, amid the ruins. They did not celebrate loudly. They simply realized that they were still alive. There were no celebrations in Germany. The country was in a state of confusion. For many, it was not only the end of the war, but also the collapse of their entire worldview. People were trying to understand what would happen next. The political leaders of the Allies were already thinking about the next stage. They had to decide the fate of Germany, rebuild Europe, and create a new security system. Victory was the beginning of a great responsibility. May 8th became a day of joy, but not of oblivion. People celebrated, but they understood that the war had left deep wounds. Years of reconstruction lay ahead. The guns fell silent, but history did not stop. Victory Day in Europe became the boundary between war and a new, difficult era. Germany's surrender did not mean a return to peace in the usual sense. It opened a new phase, the phase of responsibility for the victors. Europe lay in ruins. Millions of people were left homeless. The economy was destroyed, and the state structures of many countries were paralyzed. Germany ceased to exist as a sovereign state. It was divided into occupation zones between the U.S., Great Britain, France, and the Soviet Union. Berlin, despite being located in the Soviet zone, was also divided into 4 sectors. This decision seemed technical, but it had enormous consequences for the future of Europe. The Allies agreed on the principles of demilitarization, denazification, and democratization of Germany. The goal was not only to punish the aggressor, but also to prevent a similar catastrophe from happening again. Trials of Nazi leaders began, which later resulted in the Nuremberg Tribunal. At the same time, mistrust gradually grew among the Allies. The common enemy had disappeared, and differences in their visions for the future of Europe began to surface. The Soviet Union sought to create a belt of states oriented toward Moscow. The Western Allies advocated the restoration of market economies and democratic institutions. The Potsdam Conference in the summer of 1945 was an attempt to define the post-war order. Leaders discussed borders, reparations, and the fate of the occupied territories. The decisions were difficult and often compromising. For the German population, the occupation meant harsh realities: food shortages, destroyed infrastructure, and the need to answer for the crimes of the regime. However, it also paved the way for reconstruction. The situation was no less complicated in other European countries. Poland, Czechoslovakia, and Hungary all found themselves in the Soviet Union's sphere of influence. Western Europe began a process of economic recovery, which would later be supported by the Marshall Plan. May 8, 1945, marked the beginning of a new geopolitical reality. The world was no longer what it had been before 1939. A new dividing line emerged, not between fronts, but between systems. Victory brought peace, but not harmony. Europe was entering an era of cold confrontation that would define the politics of the coming decades. After Germany's surrender, a question arose that could not be resolved by military victory alone: how to respond to crimes that exceeded the limits of cruelty. Europe knew about concentration camps, mass shootings, and deportations. The world was beginning to realize the scale of the Holocaust. Victory required not only peace, but also justice. That is why the Allies decided to establish an international tribunal to try the leaders of the Nazi regime. Nuremberg, a city that had once been a symbol of Nazi rallies, was chosen as the venue. Now it became a symbol of justice. In November 1945, the trial that went down in history as the Nuremberg Tribunal began. High-ranking officials of the Reich, ministers, military commanders, and SS leaders found themselves in the dock. They were charged with crimes against peace, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. The trial was unprecedented. For the first time in history, the international community attempted to legally determine the responsibility of state leaders for aggression and mass crimes. This was a new step in international law. The evidence presented at the trial shocked even those who already knew about the crimes of Nazism. Documents, testimonies, footage of liberated concentration camps. All of this became part of the official record. The world could no longer deny the scale of the tragedy. The verdicts varied. Some of the defendants were sentenced to death, others to life imprisonment. But the main result was not the punishment of individuals, but the establishment of a principle. Even state leaders are not immune from the law. For Germany, the process was a painful stage of rethinking. The country had to acknowledge its responsibility. Denazification became not only an administrative procedure, but also a moral challenge. Nuremberg also became a signal for the future. It laid the foundations for international criminal law and set a precedent that would be revisited in the coming decades. The surrender on May 8 ended the war physically. Nuremberg ended it morally. It showed that peace is impossible without responsibility. Thus, the war in Europe had not only a military ending, but also a legal and moral conclusion. After May 8, 1945, Europe did not celebrate for long. The ruins were a reminder of reality. Cities were destroyed, factories were ruined, railways were torn apart, and millions of people were left homeless. Victory brought peace, but not stability. The economic situation on the continent was critical. Industrial production had fallen to a minimum, food was scarce, and infrastructure lay in ruins. The winter of 1945 to 1946 was one of the harshest. People were no longer fighting for the front, but for survival. At this point, the U.S. made a strategic move. Instead of isolation, as after World War I, they chose the path of participation. In 1947, a plan for economic aid to Europe was proposed, which later became known as the Marshall Plan. Its goal was not only to restore the economy, but also to stabilize the political situation. Reconstruction became part of a new policy. Western Europe gradually restored production, trade, and democratic institutions. Germany, divided into zones, began to transform into two different states, West and East. In 1945, the United Nations was created. Its founding was a response to the catastrophe of two world wars. The world tried to create a system of collective security to prevent the tragedy from repeating itself. However, at the same time, a new conflict was forming, an ideological one. The Soviet Union established control over the countries of Eastern Europe, creating a socialist bloc. Western Europe looked to the United States for guidance. The front line had changed. Now it was the dividing line between two systems. Berlin became a symbol of this new world. The city, destroyed by war, became the center of a cold confrontation. Former allies gradually became opponents. May 8, 1945, ended the era of total war in Europe, but it ushered in an era of global tension. The world entered a period that would later be called the Cold War. Despite this, the reconstruction of Europe became one of the greatest examples of international cooperation. Countries that had recently been at war with each other began to seek common mechanisms for security and economic integration. Thus, the victory over Nazism not only ended the war, but also laid the foundation for a new world order. May 8, 1945, became not only the date of the end of the war, but also a symbol that each country preserved in its own way. Victory Day in Europe meant different things for London, Moscow, Paris, and Berlin. It became part of national memory, historical identity, and political culture. In Great Britain, this day is associated with relief and resilience. The country endured years of bombing and did not surrender. Victory Day is a reminder of the endurance of society and the role of the Allied coalition. In France, May 8th is a symbol of liberation and the restoration of statehood. After years of occupation and collaboration with the Vichy regime, the country sought a way to restore its national dignity. In the United States, Victory in Europe Day is often seen as part of the broader victory in World War II. But for Americans, it did not mark the end of the war as a whole. Fighting in the Pacific continued until August 1945. In the Soviet Union, and later in Russia and other post-Soviet countries, May 9th became one of the main public holidays. Victory is seen as the result of enormous sacrifices and heroism of the people. At the same time, for many countries in Eastern Europe, this date has a more complex meaning. Victory over Nazism also meant the beginning of Soviet influence. In Germany, May 8th has long been a day of mixed feelings. For some, it was a day of defeat. For others, a day of liberation from dictatorship. Over time, German society has increasingly come to see it as the end of the Nazi regime and the beginning of a new path. Memories of the war are preserved in memorials, museums, and archives. It is passed on through books, films, and family stories. Victory Day has become a moment when history turns into personal memory. Over the years, there are fewer and fewer eyewitnesses. But the significance of this date does not diminish. It reminds us of the consequences of total war, the danger of ideologies of hatred, and the price of freedom. May 8th is not just the end of a conflict. It is a reminder that peace requires effort and responsibility. The memory of this date continues to shape politics, public discourse, and international relations even in the 21st century. May 8, 1945, was the date that ended one era and opened another. 6 years of war in Europe had formally ended, but its consequences continued to shape the future of the continent and the entire world. Germany's surrender was not just a military event. It was a historic turning point. Germany, which had launched its aggression in 1939, now lay in ruins. Its cities were destroyed, its economy paralyzed, its political system eliminated. But with the collapse of the Reich, the era of total domination of Nazi ideology in Europe also came to an end. For the Allies, this day confirmed that a coalition war could lead to victory. The United States, Great Britain, the Soviet Union, and other countries acted together despite deep differences. Their cooperation made it possible to defeat one of the most powerful military machines of its time. However, victory brought a new reality. Europe was divided not only by ruins, but also by ideologies. The line that ran through Berlin gradually became a symbol of the Cold War. The world entered a period of global confrontation between the West and the East. Germany's surrender also became the basis for the formation of new international structures. The United Nations, the system of international law, the principles of collective security. All of this was a response to the tragedy of World War. For millions of people, this day meant a return home. Soldiers left the front lines, prisoners of war awaited release, families hoped for reunions. But for many, the war remained forever. In their memories, in their losses, in their physical and moral wounds. May 8th became a symbol of victory over Nazism, but also a reminder of the fragility of peace. It proved that aggression and totalitarianism can be stopped, but the price is extremely high. The history of Victory Day in Europe is the story of the end of one of the darkest chapters in human history. But at the same time, it is a story about responsibility. Victory provided an opportunity to build a new world order, and the fate of future generations depended on how this opportunity was utilized. Today, May 8th remains more than just a date on the calendar. It is a day of remembrance, a day of awareness, and a day of reminder that peace is not a given. It is the result of a choice. This is how the war in Europe ended. This is how a new history of the world began.